powerful rulers was a world away from Windsor and Westminster in Ashby de la Zouch in Leicestershire. Why Ashby? Well, it was the stronghold of the Hastings family. Queen Margaret's granddaughter married into this family. It was the offspring of this Hastings Plantagenet line that I had to follow. Everybody has a family, everybody has roots, and I began to uncover the sort of extraordinary personal stories that everyone finds when they explore their family tree. The only difference was that the Hastings lived in a massive castle, and but for an accident of history, they would have been ruling the country. By the time of Elizabeth I, the heir to Ashby, and therefore our alternative Plantagenet monarch, was Henry Hastings, 3rd Earl of Huntingdon. Forget the bloke with the 6 wives, this is the real Henry VIII. This Henry was no less vicious than his namesake. Henry was known as the Puritan Earl. Up until now, the Hastings Plantagenets had been staunch Catholics. Don't forget that Henry's great-grandmother Margaret had actually been a Catholic martyr. But Henry instituted his own mini-Reformation and started persecuting the Catholics zealously. There's one story where he punished a housewife who'd been hiding a Catholic priest by laying her on the ground, putting a door on top of her, and then squashing her to death. Henry was happy to serve the Tudor Queen. He didn't know the rules had been broken, but records show she was only too aware of his pedigree. There's a lovely bit here that says that Queen Elizabeth became ill and she started worrying about the fact that she hadn't got an heir, and someone said to her, "Don't panic, because Henry, Earl of Huntingdon, has got a legitimate claim." And amazingly, she immediately became better. And that was the last time, until I came along, that there was any hint that the Hastings Plantagenets might actually have a claim to the throne. For hundreds of years, the royal family tree would weave its various branches through British history. It would survive threats and crises, but no one would look back at its roots and suggest the whole line of succession was fatally flawed. 80 years on, the Tudors had been succeeded by their cousins the Stuarts, and the person wearing the crown was Charles I. When Charles slid to defeat in the English Civil War, the Hastings Plantagenets stood by him to the end. Supporting the king cost them their family seat here at Ashby, which was slighted by Cromwell's troops. Nowadays, if we say we've been slighted, we mean that someone's been a bit sarcastic to us and we feel vaguely miffed. But in the 17th century, slighting meant taking a building back to ground zero. You can see what Cromwell's men did here. They completely blew up half the building. These massive walls completely gone. And the rest of it, they left open to the elements. It was an absolute loss of property and power and status. On their behalf, I was outraged at the irony that our Plantagenet family should have lost so much through sticking by the royals who'd supplanted them. But aristocracy has an uncanny knack of clawing its way back. As I followed the alternative royal family down the centuries and across the country, their depleted fortunes were restored. Ashby was replaced by other magnificent family seats. But then, just as I was well on my way to finding a candidate for Britain's real monarch alive today, I stumbled on a completely unexpected and dramatic clash between our alternative line and the monarch of the day. The Hastings had taken on the title of Earl of Loudon. This was their enormous castle in Scotland. It was known as the Windsor of the North, 365 rooms, but building it emptied the family bank accounts. It was the first year of the reign of Queen Victoria, Our real monarch at the time should have been George Lord Hastings, the Earl of Loudon. He had lots of titles, plenty of castles, but very little cash. Which meant that his sister, the Lady Flora, wasn't nearly as eligible as you'd expect an aristocrat to be, and wasn't going to be able to marry into the nobility. She'd have to get a job. And she did. She became a lady-in-waiting to the Duchess of Kent, Queen Victoria's mother. And that was the start of big trouble. For the very first time, our royal family hit the headlines. Flora found herself right in the middle of a national scandal. It wasn't her fault. She was the victim of a family feud involving Queen Victoria, Queen Victoria's mother, who Flora was lady-in-waiting to, and a man called Sir John Conroy, who'd been acting as Victoria's unofficial stepfather since Victoria's real father died when she was 8 months old. Nowadays, newspapers print gossip about royal sex lives at the drop of a hat, but in 1839 they had to be much more circumspect. Nevertheless, nothing could stop the gossip that Sir John Conroy was far more than her mother's private secretary. Victoria hated him for that. She called him the monstrous devil incarnate. When she came to the throne, she had two ambitions. One was to get rid of all the immorality of the Regency period, and the other was to get rid of Sir John Conroy. And that is where Flora comes in. In 1838, Flora travelled down from Scotland in a carriage with Sir John Conroy. They were alone, no chaperone. There were rumours. And when months later Flora's stomach started to swell, gossip about a pregnancy became rife. It was Victoria's perfect chance to get back at Conroy. She banned Flora from court and ordered her to have an intimate examination. Victoria's high-handed attitude destroyed our Plantagenet princess's reputation. It brought Victoria into direct conflict with Flora's brother, our alternative monarch. It's all here. The examination proves that Flora's a virgin and is actually very ill. George and his family and the whole nation are outraged by Victoria's treatment of poor Flora. Listen to this from the Morning Post. Lady Flora Hastings endures with patience and resignation the anguish of a wounded spirit. A virtuous and amiable lady destroyed in the flower of her days by the slanders and the insults of court minions. Of course, they couldn't actually criticise the Queen openly, but everyone knew what the phrase court minions really referred to. This incident ended the young Victoria's honeymoon period with the British public. This is the dramatic moment in history when our alternative royal family dared to stand up to the person on the throne. Not only that, but the people mobilised behind them. Crowds jeered and hissed Victoria. Eggs were thrown at her carriage. This is big news. This is the Watergate of its time. Imagine it, when Princess Di died in the car crash and the Queen's popularity was at its lowest, no one actually took to the streets. But here, with this incident of the eggs, you can see the level of public outrage. But it got even worse because in the July, Flora died of liver cancer. Here's her obituary just there. The public now were at boiling point. Queen Victoria could scarcely go out of the palace, whereas Flora was regarded as a victim, some kind of martyr figure almost. But what the newspapers can't show you is what was going on in private. Her brother George challenged Lord Melbourne, who was the Queen's chief representative, to a duel. He couldn't challenge the Queen herself, of course, because she was a woman. In other words, here you've got our Plantagenet George IV going head-to-head with the chief representative of the heir to the Tudor throne. In the event, the duel never took place, but the tragedy was neither forgiven nor forgotten by the Hastings family. They issued their own stamps in her memory. Flora was buried in state at Loudon. The Union flag was never flown again over the castle. The publicity about Flora made my research easier. But later on in Victoria's reign, our alternative royal family were hit by a massive change in their fortunes. In a dramatic twist of fate, the noble Plantagenets were torn off their pedestal. It was an event that totally transformed my search for the person who should be on the throne today. This was the man responsible. Henry Waysford Charles Plantagenet Rawdon Hastings. He was, frankly, a bounder. He even stole his friend's fiancée. But he had only one real love in his life. Henry was married to the track. As soon as he came of age, he started to run horses and bet heavily.
Can I have 10 to win on Turner?
Number 7, £10.
If I wanted to make a really big bet here, would you take it?
It depends how big a bet you're talking about, really.
$5.5 million.
I think you might struggle, certainly at Goodwood anyway. I've never heard of anyone asking for a bet bigger than £1 million, but there was somebody asked for £1 million bet last year.
What would you think of someone who put £5.5 million on the horse?
I think they've either got too much money or they're just trying to get rid of some for somebody else.
Well, that's exactly what Henry Hastings did. He'd already spent virtually all of the family fortune, about £100 million in today's money. He just got £120,000 left. That's $5.5 million today. And he put it all on one horse in one race to win.
It was the 22nd of May, 1867, the Derby. Henry had backed the odds-on favourite Verdun.
They were off. Right from the start, Verdun was in the lead. All the way round, he was leading. Then in the final furlong, a rank outsider called the Hermit started to gain ground. With every step, he got closer. The line, the Hermit won by a neck. The sport of kings had destroyed our King Henry X.
By the age of 25, our Henry X had frittered away the family fortune, running up millions of pounds of debts. He got another name, the King of the Plungers. A year later, his liver gave out. On his death, the family were forced to auction wines, art and the family estates to pay his creditors. Loudon Castle today is a shell overlooking a theme park complete with rides and wallabies to attract the masses. Suddenly, our alternative line had run slap bang into the real world. I realised that the real king or queen today probably wasn't some toff living in a stately home, but an ordinary person in a normal house. As I traced the last few generations, I found the truth. From the 20th century, there were more names and faces. Tragic deaths in both world wars that meant we should have had both a Queen Edith and, until last year, a Queen Barbara I. And then suddenly I was there. I couldn't quite believe it, but I had a name and an address for the person who should be ruling Britain today.
In 1960, when the present occupant of Buckingham Palace was still in the first decade of her reign, a young man set sail from England. He was heading for a new life abroad. He didn't know it, but he was leaving his kingdom behind. Good morning.
After discovering a flaw in the royal succession, I traced the line of true kings and queens that leads to the person who's Britain's real monarch. But he'd emigrated. The true heir to the throne was born in Britain, but now lives in the Australian outback.
That's all there is to it. That's it. Not much difficulty finding him there, should we? Wouldn't think so. Should we go down and have a look? Yeah, sounds good.